The Toronto Maple Leafs continue to make moves as they've made a few sneaky signings to help shore up their blue line, as well as some other moves that are very interesting. So I want to stay tuned for that because we're going to discuss exactly who those players are and how it could affect Brad Living's plan going forward for the rest of this offseason. So stay tuned for all that. But before we do, if you're part of the large percent who aren't subscribed to the channel, make sure to hit that subscribe button. It would mean the world to Darius and myself. But Darius, let's just break it down. There's a lot of Maple Leafs news coming out. Obviously, they made a few more signings, and with Yanni Hakanpää's status of being a Toronto Maple Leaf up in the air, the Leafs went out and added some more depth into the blue line. They also added some forward as well. So we're going to break all of it down. And these signings aren't the most flashy, but I think it might paint a better picture of what Brad Living's plans might be going forward as free agency continues to get closer and closer to kind of coming to a conclusion regarding what the Leafs need to do. But let's just dive right into it. So they've announced 3 signings, each with an AAV of $750,000. Now, none of these 3 players are super exciting. They won't jump off the paper, but some of them are pretty interesting. So Darius, we're going to break them all down, and I want to see which one of these 3 do you think is going to make the biggest impact. Obviously, we have Myers, Perret, and Mermis. So we're going to start with let's start with the defenseman. I mean, there's 2 defensemen here, but we're going to start with one of the defensemen. Very interesting. So Mermis is captain 2 AHL teams, and he is 30 years old. So even if the Iowa stint was brief this year, a nice leadership addition for a young Marlies defense. And it appears, this is from the original report from Jonas Siegel, that the 30-year-old defenseman is joining the Leafs and is now listed on their active roster. So what is your thoughts on this? I think it's very interesting that they've signed 2 defensemen and a forward. And I don't know how much. A lot of it, I think, depends on Yanni Hakanpää regarding the depth of defenseman. Because right now, he would be technically our 7th defenseman if he's healthy. He probably would slot into the starting lineup a lot of games. But what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, one thing I noticed about all 3 signings is all 3 guys have won championships, barring, they are in junior, but they are championship caliber players at a certain level. So that was one thing I thought was interesting. And they're all pretty low risk, right? Like I'll get to Mermis in a second, but it's all low risk, like very minimum deals. Some of them are 1-year deals. It's like totally fine, right? In my eyes, I thought this is great depth signing. No problem with that. To go to Dakota Mermis, again, 30 years old. I think he's going to be a pretty good depth option. Like he played some games in the NHL last year. Like he played for the Minnesota Wild, right? And if you look at some of his charts, like you said, he doesn't jump off the page at you. He's not a superstar or anything like that. But again, a good depth option, a guy who can come in, who's played NHL games in case there's an injury or something like that, right down the road. So I don't hate this player. He's played in the OHL. I like guys who play in the OHL because it's closer to the NHL game with the travel and all that stuff. So I like that. He played on the London Knights, won a championship there. He won a championship with the Oshawa Generals. He was on the team that shut down Connor McDavid in the OHL finals too. Obviously, that doesn't really translate to the NHL game at the level Connor McDavid's at, but this is a pretty good defenseman. And if he does end up playing in the AHL for the majority of the year, it's going to be a young Marlies team, so he'll be able to help with that. So I like this signing, very low risk. And it's a guy who can come in if need be at the NHL level too.
Yeah, at the very least, depth for the Marlies and depth for the Maple Leafs as well. But, I mean, if you rewind back to last season when the Leafs got Simon Benoit, obviously he played a bigger part on the team for the Ducks when he was there than Mermis did for the Wild. But Benoit now ended up being one of the most crucial, important players. So having depth like that is very, very important. And ultimately, you mentioned it. He's 30 years old. He's not a young prospect anymore. He is there in case someone gets injured. He might be the 7th defenseman if Yanni Hakanpää ultimately doesn't get signed. So this is probably the guy who has the most likely outcome and the most likely chance of becoming an actual piece to this team going forward. And maybe given the opportunity, he will produce similar to how Simon Benoit did last year when he was given a full opportunity again on an actually good team that wasn't, unlike the Ducks, that had a horrible defensive core there. So it's very interesting. Let us know in the comments what your thoughts are on that. But Darius, we also have Philippe Myers, same thing, Phil Myers to discuss. And you can see here from Kyle Kushman saying Phil Myers was among the best even-strength defensemen in the AHL last year. An excellent depth signing that fits what the Leafs want. He is 6'6", had a cup of coffee with the Marlins in 2022 as a loan. If he's the guy he was last year, he can push for NHL minutes. So it seems like the Leafs are just going ahead and signing AHL defensemen who, if needed, can really fit into what this group needs, especially given their current defensive pairing, their 3 pairings right now, and kind of the size that they're really lacking right now.
Yeah, a lot of people are thinking like they're just signing AHL defensemen, but I actually think this is the most surprising signing and the most exciting for me out of all 3 of them, out of the depth signings, because there was a lot of hype around this guy when he was playing for the Huskies in the QMJHL and he won a championship there. And then coming out of that to the Flyers, there was a lot of hype around him. Like he was going to be a really, really good defenseman. And obviously the size is a big factor too at the NHL level. So he kind of lost that right over the years, and COVID affected a lot of these players too who were just hitting their stride in the NHL. So he's been bounced around a lot, and he was with the Marlies too, like you mentioned, right, on a stint. It was a loan or something like that. I don't think he was officially a part
Long,
of the
yeah.
Leafs organization, but now he is. And he played pretty well there. So you know, if he plays in the AHL, that's great. You know, he can develop further. He's not exactly young either, but I think there's potential there for him to come up. I mean, like you mentioned too, Simone Benoit came out of nowhere this year, right? And this is a guy who had a lot of promise before. Right shot defenseman, didn't play too much with Tampa Bay either. But you know, you can lend to the fact that Tampa Bay was a really good team and were winning Stanley Cups when he was in the organization. So I think this is a bit of a wild card in the way that I wonder if, you know, he takes a step again. He might be too old. Maybe it is over, but there was a lot of promise and COVID did hinder him a lot. So I wonder if, you know, he's a guy who might surprise this year. It could be interesting.
Yeah, looking at the charts we just showed, like they're looking very promising. Kyle saying that, Kyle Cushman was saying basically he could push for NHL minutes if he gets the opportunity to, similar to Mermis as well. And you can look, shout out to Kyle Cushman for all this, but he basically gave a little rundown on the three. Mermis we've already discussed. Phil Myers, he was, like you mentioned, on a loan. Darius, and then of course Prairie was a dev camp invite in 2021. He's a 6'4" center who has steadily improved in the AHL. So another guy who could be potentially probably less of an option this year, depending on who they sign, though. Right now they're lacking forwards. When we go into some of their stats a little bit here, we also have a player or someone speaking out on a couple of the prospects. But you mentioned Darius. He played 47 games, Mermis that was, for the Wild last year. Like, this is a guy who has NHL experience. It isn't just an AHL signing. Obviously, right now he's projected to be in AHL to start, in the AHL, sorry, to start the year. But he's a guy who definitely could make an impact on the team. And he had 8 points in 47 games. So again, points aren't much for defensemen, but he looked okay. Like, he wasn't terrible. And then of course Myers played 5 games, so a bit less there, and he's 27. So he's someone who maybe, if performs well, similar to Simone Benoit performing well last year, could maybe earn a, you know, be part of the longer term goals for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Whereas Mermis, he's also 30, he's not super old, could fit in as well. But yeah, any thoughts on that before I get onto a quote? He played a lot of games last year, so in the NHL, sorry.
Yeah, there's something to be said about that, right? He doesn't have to come in and be your second pairing defenseman, but if somebody gets injured, this is the type of guy who, you know, has experience playing in the NHL, right? You don't have to call up a Marley or a guy who's like 20 years old. You can insert this guy into the lineup and he kind of knows what's going on, right? I think there's a lot to that. So, and same goes for Philippe Myers in a way, right? Like, he does have experience playing in the NHL, less, but or less as of late, I should say, but I still think there is something with that player. So it's going to be interesting to watch. And, you know, I like the depth signings, super low risk. And I think that, you know, you might find, or you might be a little bit surprised this year.
Yeah, I like him. And again, at this point last season, the Benoit signing, we didn't really think much of it. And he ultimately is now a part of probably the second pairing on the blue line. So it's crazy how things change with that. And one thing before we do wrap up here, we can see Jonathan Tavares speaking out on some of the stuff, some of the new Leaf signings in general. They're great pros. 2 of them won the Cup recently. Obviously, we're excited for the lessons we can learn from them. And just kind of speaking out in the overall signings is pretty exciting because, quite frankly, the moves that the Leafs have made so far, whether they're sneaky, more depth signings like they did yesterday, or some of the bigger ones like OEL and Chris Tanev, they're all going to play a big part of the Leafs going forward. But that'll wrap it up. Let us know in the comments what your thoughts are. See you soon.